Hey, today we're going to talk about quotation marks and specifically how you punctuate around them, and of course when you should quote things, and a little bit about documentation too, which we'll be covering in an upcoming video. So let's get to it. Quotation marks, in a lot of ways, I like to think about as your essay's like a house, and quotation marks are when you're inviting other people into your writing. So when you do that, just like when you invite someone into your house, you generally don't invite them in and then just walk away and not talk to them. So you have to do some things to get them in there smoothly. First of all, let's talk about when to quote. So when you quote, you quote when you use someone's exact words, whether they're spoken or written, and you put them in the quotation marks. The quotation marks show these are someone's exact words. So here's a quote from Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is known for saying, "Insanity is when we keep doing the same thing and expect different results." So we have our quotation marks around the words that Einstein said. Now, if we put those words in our own words, we paraphrase, then we don't use the quote marks, but we still need to say who said it. So here we have Albert Einstein said, "We're crazy if we expect something different when we just do the same thing over and over." And so there you can see that we got his idea, and so we have to give him credit, but we don't use the quotation marks because we put it in our own words. Now, one of the things that we have to pay attention to is how do we punctuate with around those quotation marks. In American English, commas and periods always go inside the final quotation mark, like so. See right there after so, we've got the period and then the quotation mark. It's different in British English, and I'm not sure about other versions of English, but American English, that final quotation mark, the punctuation goes inside if it's a comma or a period. So the plain simple things, the just regular punctuation, is always going to go inside. With semicolons and colons, they go outside. So if this was a semicolon or colon, we'd have the quotation mark and then the outside. I think about it this way. They're weird, so we put them on the outside. Exclamation points and question marks go with the part they belong to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, rarely do you have any type of punctuation inside the opening quotation. So here's an example. 60s, and you can see there's a quotation and then there's an apostrophe because we're saying 1960s music is great. So it's very rare if you're putting a quotation mark inside that first part of the set, then really think about why am I doing that. It's very, very rare, so again, just really think about it. All right, so let's take a look at some of this. Here's the quote. So periods and commas always go inside, and so let me just real quick. So I always think of it this way. Periods and commas, they always go inside that quotation mark, and then those exclamation points and question marks, it depends. Do they go with just the quote or do they go with that whole sentence? And that's what you have to figure out. Is the whole sentence an exclamation? Is the whole sentence a question? Or is it just the quote that's a question or exclamation? If it's just the quote, it's going to go inside because we want to say that belongs to the quote. If the whole sentence, it's going to go outside because we're saying it belongs to everything. So here are examples. Did you know that he said, "I like English class"? Now this whole thing is a sentence because we say, "Did you know that?" And anytime we say, "Did you know?" we are questioning. So here it goes outside because the whole thing is a sentence. In this case, my son often asked, "Can you read me another story?" This question mark goes inside the quotes because I'm just making a statement. I'm just telling you my son would ask me this thing. And so it's not the whole sentence that's the question, but only the question mark. So that's the way to think about it. If you think about, is it the whole sentence or just the quote, that's where you decide where do those quotation marks and exclamation points go. So The basics of that is if it's a period or a comma at the end of your quote, then put it inside the quotation mark. If it's a semicolon or a colon or a semicolon, put it outside. Kick it out. It's weird. Don't want it inside that quotation mark. If it's that exclamation point or that question mark, does it go just with the quote or does it go with the whole sentence? And if you keep that in mind, that'll keep you straight with that punctuation in the final, at the end of a quote. So that leaves us with what do we do with the stuff around the quote, specifically if we have a couple of things. And the first thing is he said, she said. So if we have any version of he said, she said, we're going to set that off as extra. And of course, if it's before, then if it's before we have whatever someone said, then we're going to have it outside of the quotes, because remember, inside of the quotes, we rarely start off with any kind of punctuation. That's just weird. If it's at the end, periods and commas, if we're saying he said, she said, we're treating it like extra information. Those periods and commas always go inside those final quotation marks. And if it's in the middle, if we have a quote and we put it in the middle, then of course, when we end the first part of the quote, periods and commas always go inside. When we end the quote in the end, it's going to go, if it's a period or, well, it's not going to have it in it. Let's look at it. It's easier to see. So here we go. Bill and Ted shouted, comma, be excellent to one another and party on. So that's a version of he said or they said. Any version. He said, she said, anything. He said, comma, let's go eat. She replied, comma, pizza. So replied is another way to say she said. Here's a quote from one of my favorite dark comedies. My friend looked at me and exclaimed, comma, and we start our quote, you got some lettuce in your grill, girl. Bill and Ted shouted, comma, quote, be excellent to one another and party on. And here you can see be excellent to one another and party on is the exciting part. So that exclamation point goes inside that final quote. So it doesn't matter if you're saying said, exclaimed, replied, noted, wrote, questioned, whatever that word is that is similar to he said, she said, we always use a comma with that when we're introducing a quote. Now, when we have that exclamation point or that quotation mark, these are our terminal marks, just like a period is a terminal, an ending mark. What we do is we're not going to put a comma with it. That sounds great. Exclamation point, and we finish our quote, he said, because we're not going to triple up. We rarely triple up. I'll show you one situation where we would triple up on punctuation, but really if you've got more than two, and usually one of those would be a quotation mark, then really think about that. Are you doing that correctly? Use commas correctly, exclamation point. And there's those quotes, said Kelly. So there, this is the exception to using the comma with the he said and she said. Be excellent to one another and party on, advised Bill and Ted. So if it's the terminal mark, if it's exclamation point or that question mark in the quote, and especially these are examples where what they said comes first, don't put a comma in there also. Now, when you're writing dialogue and conversations, and just a little note here, when you have a conversation back and forth, you start a new paragraph to show the change in speakers. He said, let's go eat. And then boom, we'd start a new paragraph. Pizza, she asked. Sure, how about that new place around the corner? Okay, she replied, let's get going. Right, but first I'm going to feed the dog and you should probably call your mom since she tried to call you earlier. You notice there are two places here where he says, how about that place around the corner? And, I'm going to feed the dog and call your mom. Where we don't even have to have a he said or he exclaimed or remarked or anything like that, because we're creating new paragraphs with each speaker. So we know it's going back and forth. And so if you have a conversation going on, make sure that you attend to that correctly. Now, when we use sources in our formal writing, in this class we're going to study both MLA style and APA style. If it's a long quote, so it's in MLA that is more then four typed lines or more. So if we have four typed lines or more, then what we're going to do is we're going to indent it. In APA, it's 40 words or more. And so we're going to indent it, but we're not going to use those quote marks. The quote marks show somebody said this. And here, if we indent it, we're saying somebody said this. So there are a couple of things I want to talk about in this example. Let's take a look. One place we can clearly see the change in our society's formality is in Edgar Allan Poe's A Few Words About Etiquette. And notice that we have quote marks around a few words on etiquette because that's the title of his essay. So remember, when we use titles in our works, we're going to put quotation marks around them if they're short works. So the short works, your short works, right? They're short, so we do this quote. Can you do this with me in class? I make everybody do it. Do it. It's kinesthetic memory, right? Quotation marks go around essays. They go around articles. They go around one page on a whole website. It would go around one episode of a whole TV show. The TV show's big. One episode of The Simpsons. Simpsons is huge. You watch all of that. That's huge. But one episode, it's a quote. So we're putting those quote marks to show this is a poem, a short story, any of those things. If we have the title of a book, The Simpsons, a whole TV show, a whole website, kelli.ninja. If you're going to read everything on my website, that's a lot of reading. A whole newspaper, all of the writer's reference. Those titles, remember, we put those in italics. So one other way we use quotation marks, and this is true in all of your academic and formal writing, in the text of your essay for all of the citation styles, is we use those quotation marks to show this is a short work. We use those italics to show this is a long work. All right, so that's why we have those quotation marks there. So this is what Poe has said in his Few Words on Etiquette. He has said, and I'm going to read it like I imagine Poe thought it. Familiarity of manner is of the greatest vice of society, and where our acquaintance finds himself entitled to say, "Allow me, my dear fellow," or any such phrase, cut him directly. This clearly shows a view that discourages a casual tone with those we do not know well. So a couple of things are going on here. Notice that acquaintance is in italics. Well, in Poe's original essay, he had that put in italics. So at the end of this quote, I'm going to put parentheses, and I'm going to say original emphasis. That tells the reader Poe did that. If I had done that, say I was writing a paper about how, or how we talk to different strata of people we know, our acquaintances, our family, our employers, our professors, our students, and I wanted to emphasize that, and I italicized it, then I would put emphasis added. But here, this shows that's it. And you notice that this is directly from Poe, so in his paper, "Allow me, my dear fellow," he had that in quotes, so I leave them in there. But I didn't have to put quotes around this quote from Poe because it's a longer quote. Now, the other thing I did, and I'll this is reiterated when we talk about integrating actually sources into our papers, is I made sure and I talked about this quote. Remember, you never want to end a paragraph. I won't say never, but rarely. Think consciously about ending a paragraph, or especially your essay, with a quote. In the end, it's your ideas. Somebody said, write this and tell me what you think. And so you always want to be making sense of that. That is your place to say, this is how we see this. This is how it matters. This is what point it makes. This is what perspective it offers us. So that's always your place of power to give that quote and then say, here's what it means. It's also another way to make your paper longer. You get to use quotes, somebody else's words, which help make your paper longer. But then the point is, you talk about them. You could give me 10 quotes. I'm going to think about them, what I think about them. The point is for you to say, here's what I think about them. So remember that explaining a quote is always important. All right, let's move on. Here is one of those times when you may have 3 punctuation points or 3 punctuation marks in a row. Whenever you give a quote inside of a quote, you're going to use the single quotation marks for the quote that is inside of it. Of course, we're going to put the double quotation marks on the whole outside. So here's the example. She said to me, so here are her words. One of my favorite quotes comes from Barbara Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible. And here is the quote. Notice we've got what's the apostrophe, the single quote mark. I've seen how you can't learn anything when you're trying to be the smartest person in the room. And because the end of that is the end of Kingsolver's quote, so we have again that single quotation mark, but also the end of what she said, so we have those double quotation marks. So whenever that you take a quote from someone, a lot of times they may have said, I like this, or so-and-so also knows. So you have your quote marks, unless it's a long quote and you're going to indent it, you have your quote marks around the whole thing, and then whatever that quote is inside, just use the apostrophe, the single quote marks to show that. So when you look at your quote and you're like, oh, there's a quote, I want all of this, and there's a quote inside of here, just turn those double quotes that are inside your quote into singles and put the doubles around the part you're pulling out from the whole thing. Alrighty. Then another question we have to ask and think about is, so we covered, well, let me go back to the camera here. So we covered the he said, she said, and it's extra information. We know the rule that if our extra information comes at the end of our sentence, and we're going to have a comma there because extra information, he said, she said, replied, pointed out, noted, wrote, whatever word we use, then we're going to have the comma, the end of the quote, the comma, and our quotation marks, and then we'll have our version of he said, she said. Okay. If it's at the first, of course, we'll have he said, she said, comma, and then start our quote, and in the middle we apply those rules to what happens at the first of a quote or at the end for commas, that kind of thing. And of course, if we have an exclamation point, we talked about that, or a question mark, then we don't do question mark, comma, quotation marks. But one of the other, when you're thinking about putting a quote in, the first thing I always ask myself is, do I have some version of he said, she said? Because that's my extra information, and I know I'll use commas. But the next rule uses colons, and we've already covered this one. Remember, to use a colon, what's that rule? We've got to have, that main rule is we've got to have a full sentence before the colon. So he said, she said, is not a full sentence. We're waiting for what did they say. It's just that extra information that gives us that context. So if we have a full sentence, then boom, we put the colon. So here is mine. Les Brown is the author of one of my favorite quotes. I could stop right there and never tell you the quote, but I want to give it to you, so I'm going to put the colon in because that's a full sentence. You don't have to be great to get started, but you do have to get started to be great. And then a period and close my quote. So if you have that complete sentence before the quote, use that colon. Now that leaves us, so that takes care of like most of what's going to happen when we use quotes is we're going to use some form of he said, she said, noted, wrote, whatever, exclaimed, or we'll have a full sentence and then give the quote. And that's really the way we punctuate a quote we're putting in there to decide, do I use commas or colon? 99% of the time. But once in a while we're taking part of a sentence, a quote, and we're not taking the whole sentence. We're just taking part of it and we're going to put it in with our writing. And at that point we have to decide a couple of things. One has to do with context and the other one has to do with if those quote marks weren't there and this whole thing was my sentence, would I use a comma? Would I use a colon? Well, if we've got he said, she said, we'd use a comma. If it was a full sentence, we'd use a colon. So then the next thing we have to do is apply those comma rules. Is this a list of things? Very rare, but could happen. Okay. Is it hooking two sentences together with one of those fanboys? Or is it another type of extra information? So let's take a look at this one from Charles Hudson. Charles Hudson noted that the prisoners escaped by squeezing through a tiny window 18 feet above the floor of their cell. Now we do have Charles Hudson noted, which is another version of he said, But check it out. We've got other words in there. That the prisoners escaped, and then there's his quote, by squeezing through a tiny window 18 feet above the floor of the cell. Now, Charles Hudson noted that the prisoners escaped. That's a period. He said, people escaped. People escaped. There we go. But is that really the heart of his sentence? Remember, with that sentence, we have to have that subject and that predicate, so somebody or something doing something, but we also have to have that main idea. I'm 5 foot tall. 18 feet is 3.5 of me, just about, standing on my head. Think about that. However tall you are, get that up to 18 feet. Tiny window. Prisoners escaped. I always picture this big room. Tiny window. It's not just that they escaped. The point of his sentence is really how they escaped. So in this case, when we go back to this, if we put a comma there, then we're saying this is all extra stuff. And the other thing we know is that by is something the mouse can do to the house. It's one of those prepositions. The mouse can be by the house. So we're not going to put a comma there, even if we didn't have these quote marks. The prisoners escaped by squeezing through a tiny window 18 feet above the floor of their cell. That sentence itself, without the quotation marks, doesn't need any commas. So once the easiest way to decide what kind of punctuation am I going to use to introduce or get this in is to say, do I have he said, she said? And actually, most of the time, that is what we'll have. And another, I would say, 50, 60% probably he said, she said. I've never done the research on it. But the other thing we'd have more commonly is to have that full sentence and then we put that colon in. But once in a while we're doing something like that where we're integrating part of a sentence into our sentence. And that's actually a higher skill that you want to practice because it makes your writing more smooth. Remember, you always have to attribute. Make sure you always let people know who said that. Whose words are these? So whenever that happens, when it's not the extra information of he said, she said, or it's not the full sentence that we put a colon after, remember that what you need to do is say, would I put a comma here if this whole thing was my sentence? Okay, so that takes care of really our major issues. There are a couple of things you do not want to do. Don't use quotation marks around the title of your own essay unless you're writing about it in another essay. So when you write your essay at the top, you have your title. Don't put quotation marks around that. If you write an essay and say, in my essay, then boom, pop those quotation marks around that. Don't put quote marks around words that are casual or slang. Only use quotes around words used in a very unusual way. And I'm going to put a link to this video and watch this video. It's the corner gas video. It's like, maybe 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes. It's just a clip from a Canadian sitcom. But it really does a good job of really showing you why you don't want to just be willy-nilly with your quote marks. But I want you to think about it this way. If I say, I'm cool, do I look cool? No, kind of dorky is what I think. So I call them dork quotes. I'm cool, right? If something's free, is it really free? When you write, you're writing a personal essay and you say he was hot or she was hot, right? We're going to know if you mean like hot because she was hot when she walked by. I could see she was sweating. Or she was hot and it's going to, that implication, attractive. So remember, your readers, even your college professors, are real people who live in the real world. And we speak normal language. Okay, which means, in general, you may have some who are much more formal, and they're like, they won't get that. But then you probably wouldn't be using those words in writing to that professor or that professional. So if you're writing something that is more a personal essay, a more familiar essay, you don't need to put, they were hot or, it was cool. Because, again, I don't look I'm cool. Yeah. Not cool. Okay. So really work to avoid that. Sometimes words are used in a way that is very different or something very new, and in which case we might want to do that. In a lot of kind of science and medicine, they may be using what is a more familiar word in a more specific technical way, in which case you'll see them do that in their paper, and you can do that as well. But really, avoid the dork quotes, okay, because you don't want to look cool like me. All right. So that pretty much covers the basics of quotation marks. And just remember, always remember, that if you learn those rules like a pro, you can break them like an artist.